Hello guys, welcome to another video. Now, back when the Path of Exile 2 ascendancies were first revealed, I was super excited to be able to get into the whole theory craft and build craft revolving around them, especially in combination with the new Path of Exile 2 passive tree. And I still think that the Path of Exile 2 ascendancies are pretty good, and some of them are very well designed, but some of them have a bit of a problem going on, and that is to do with the illusion of choice. So what do I mean by that exactly? Well, let's kind of get straight into it and discuss one of the ascendancies that I think there is a problem with, and that's the Deadeye. So the Deadeye is a ranger ascendancy, and this class has basically been pulled straight from PoE 1. There's some differences there, but they've also borrowed a lot of the ideas that PoE 1 had with the Deadeye. I actually want to kind of take this opportunity to compare the two, because whilst I don't like to compare things between PoE 1 and PoE 2 all that often because they are very different games, this is actually a really good opportunity to compare the two, because one game, in my opinion, does this really well and the other one just doesn't do it very well at all. And that's in regards to this first branch here, the Tailwind branch. So in Path of Exile 2, for the Deadeye, you get this first node here. It grants Tailwind on skill use, so you get Tailwind every time you use a skill, and you lose all Tailwind when hit. Now, Tailwind is a little bit different in PoE 2 compared to what it is in PoE 1, but the idea is pretty much the same. You're gaining like a stacking buff there that is providing you more and more speed. You got more movement speed, more skill speed, and so this node is very strong at being able to speed up your character. The faster you are, the faster you move around, the faster you can clear, the faster you can deal damage, things like that. However, on this node is a big downside immediately paired with that upside. You lose all Tailwind when you get hit. Now, whilst I would argue in favour of this downside on this node, because obviously gaining Tailwind up to its maximum is very, very strong, and you kind of need a downside there to balance this out, there is a bit of a problem with this node, and the problem actually comes with the node after it, Wind Ward. So Wind Ward is 3% less damage taken per Tailwind. That on its own is an extremely strong node, and that's the reason why it's kind of locked behind this first node, and it's like an extra bit that you can then invest into to make Tailwind even more effective. But the problem here is that there isn't really a choice going from Gathering Winds to Wind Ward. There's no choice being made there. You're essentially gaining 3% less damage taken per Tailwind, so that's up to 30% less damage taken, while you actually have a Tailwind. But the problem here is that if you're taking Gathering Winds, you are pretty much always taking Wind Ward, because there's no real choice being made there, right? This is just, Wind Ward is this much better. There's no kind of trade-off happening there. And what I'd like to do to explain this point further, I'd like to head over to the Path of Exile 1 Deadeye to actually showcase exactly what I mean. So here is the PoE 1 Deadeye, and here's the branch that is basically ripped straight from PoE 1 and placed into PoE 2. It's slightly different, but the concept is very much the same. So instead of gathering stacks of Tailwind, you actually gain stacks of Gale Force instead, and you always have Tailwind, and Gale Force is basically a multiplier for how strong that Tailwind is. So you can see there that, Tailwind grants you increased action speed, and then each stack of Gale Force improves that Tailwind and sort of grants more effect to it, so you get basically a stronger Tailwind once you have maximum stacks of Gale Force, right? But you'll notice here on the first node, on the Gathering Winds node, you do not lose those stacks of Gale Force when you get hit. So you're able to take Gathering Winds as a purely offensive notable, and that is going to improve the speed of your character, right? You're going to be able to go much faster, but you don't lose the stacks of Gale Force when you actually get hit. Now, the second node that is hidden behind this is Wind Ward, and Wind Ward then provides you with a very compelling decision. You can actually make the choice to convert your Gale Force into a defensive mechanic, 4% less damage taken per Gale Force, but in a trade-off for that, you will lose all Gale Force when you actually get hit. So let's say you get hit by a massive boss slam and you're at 10 stacks, that's 40% less damage taken for that one hit, and then all of your Gale Force is gone and you must build it back up again. The interesting thing there is that when you actually take Gathering Winds, you have a compelling choice presented to you. You can trade off this very strong offensive buff there, and you can trade it into a very powerful defensive mechanic, but there's the downside there that you lose all Gale Force when you're hit. That is a compelling choice to make. But on the PoE 2 version of the Deadeye, there isn't really any sort of choice going on there. You basically have Tailwind and you already lose it when you get hit. And then you can just add this less damage taken per Tailwind and it just kind of stacks on top of it. It's just all upside. There's no real choice being made there, which means if you're taking Gathering Winds, you are pretty much always taking Wind Ward combined with this node. So the illusion of choice there is that if you are going for Tailwind on a Deadeye, which pretty much every Deadeye is ever going to go for because this is just such a strong Ascendancy notable, you're pretty much going to take Wind Ward as well, because why wouldn't you, right? There's not really... One of these other 1-point nodes is unlikely to be better than what this provides you. You're kind of priced into taking that node. Now, in a video that I done recently, I actually discussed the exact same problem on the Witchhunter. So the Witchhunter has this branch here that grants you Sorcery Ward. And a Sorcery Ward is a skill that essentially provides a buff that takes damage before your life or energy shield or mana. And it takes elemental damage, and it basically obtains that shield based on a certain percentage of your combined armor and evasion. And this first node here, Obsessive Rituals, well, this node provides a massive downside as part of obtaining Sorcery Ward. So you get the Sorcery Ward skill, but you also have to take on this giant downside of 50% less armor and evasion rating. That is a brutal downside to be able to use Sorcery Ward. And then on the second node behind it, this is pure upside for Sorcery Ward. It makes Sorcery Ward so much stronger and so much more powerful that you've already taken on the downside of obtaining Sorcery Ward in the first place, which is 50% less armor and evasion, which cannot be understated how incredibly bad of a downside that is, which means that you're then pretty much guaranteed to be taking Ceremonial Ablution. It is a foregone conclusion. If you're taking Obsessive Rituals, you're also going to take this node behind it. So once again, there's an illusion of choice here. You're starting off on a Witchhunter, it looks like you can take Obsessive Rituals and then maybe take 3 other nodes, but in reality, you're always going to be taking these 2 notables here, which means you already lost half of your Ascendancy before you even get onto the other nodes. And this is kind of a recurring theme across a lot of the Ascendancies in Path of Exile. Over on the Titan, this kind of exists with Hulking Form, although this is a little bit different. With Hulking Form, there's a bit of an extra kind of problem going on there from a developer standpoint. They've made this node which is just absurdly strong, right? 50% increased effect of small passives is just insane. And to balance that out, they've basically provided a node before it that provides no character power whatsoever, and it instead grants you some extra inventory space, which, in my opinion, has absolutely no place on an Ascendancy, so I'm really not a big fan of either of these nodes. But how I think they should have done this is, I would like to see a node on the Titan, and I think this fits really well on the Titan, a node that prevents you from being pushed around by monsters. The whole kind of pushy thing in Path of Exile 2, in my opinion, it's a bit of a disaster. I think that it is very, very glitchy, and it feels like you're being disconnected. It feels like you're kind of rubber banding all over the place when a monster is pushing you around. And the Titan is an Ascendancy that would really thematically make sense to have a node that prevents it from being pushed around, or at least limits the amount that you get pushed around by monsters, because you're meant to be this massive, like, hulking mass of a man, and, you know, you're this huge warrior, and so it would make sense if you had a node that prevents you from getting shoved all over the place. So I think this would actually be a perfect place for that node, and that would be really a nice quality of life there for the Titan. But overall, I kind of don't really like the whole pushy mechanic and being ragdolled all over the place. I don't think it feels very good, but it is especially bad on melee classes, and Titan is kind of one of those classes that has to spend a lot of time, if they're playing a mace build that is, they have to spend a lot of time winding up attacks and doing things like that, and that is when you are most vulnerable to just getting shoved all over the place. So whilst Hulking Form is a little bit less of this kind of same issue that I'm discussing here, it kind of falls into the same category, right? And then we're moving on to the Warbringer, which has another one of these illusion of choice branches here, and it's the block branch. If you're playing block on a Warbringer, you are guaranteed to be taking both of these nodes. You're almost never ever going to see anyone taking Renly's training on its own, because the only real good use case of taking Renly's training on its own is if you were trying to convert a shield. Let's say there's a special unique shield in the game that has 0% base block chance, but it doesn't prevent you from blocking, right? In which case, Renly's Training would be a great option for that shield. And that would be a very weird kind of edge corner case for using this node on its own. But in Path of Exile 2, you can get increased block chance on the prefix of a shield. That can go up well above 40% base block chance on a shield, which means that this node really isn't that powerful on its own. And the reason why this node is even here in the first place is to be a blocker for Turtle Charm, which obviously is extremely powerful. This node is ridiculously strong. It just makes it so that you can block all damage, not just projectiles and strikes, which means you can also block slams and things like that, you know, big boss slams. So this is a very strong node, but once again, there is that illusion of choice there. If you're playing block on a Warbringer, you are taking both of these nodes. So moving up here to the, you know, Sorceress Ascendancies here, we have the Stormweaver, the Elemental Storm branch. One of these nodes actually gives you access to Elemental Storm when you critically hit with spells, and then the other one behind it is simply just making Elemental Storm so much better that if you're playing an Elemental Storm build, you are going to be taking both of these nodes. There's never a case, you know, on a Stormweaver where a build is only taking Tempest Cooler, because it just doesn't make any sense. You know, if you're playing Elemental Storm, you're going to also be taking Rain Dancer. Same can be said for the Chronomancer and the Recoup branch. You have a node here that grants you 30% of damage taken recouped as life, which is quite strong in and of itself, especially considering a lot of the recoup on the tree is not, you know, nowhere near as much as 30%. Most of it is sort of around the 5% mark, 3%, things like that. And so this second node behind it, recoup effects instead occur over 4 seconds, so that's 4 seconds instead of 8. So that's a massive, massive improvement, and, you know, you're investing into recoup if you're even taking this branch in the first place, which means that you are guaranteed to be taking both of these notables. Lastly, for these examples, I just want to discuss the Pathfinder, because the Pathfinder has this poison branch here, so you've got Contagious Contamination, which makes the most damaging poison on enemies you kill spread, you know, in a radius around them. And then you have one behind it here, which is doubling the amount of poisons that you can inflict. And it also has, you know, the downside there of 35% less poison duration, but you can overcome that downside by being able to kind of scale your skill speed and things like that, so you can apply the maximum amount of poisons. But I would argue that this is once again an illusion of choice. The only time you would ever want to take Contagious Contamination on its own is if you were playing a low tolerance build, right? So you're only scaling a single poison. In which case, though, you would probably just prefer to play a different Ascendancy, because the whole idea of Pathfinder is being able to double those poisons, and this node on its own, you know, spreading poisons in a radius, is not that strong considering there's already a Spirit Gem, right? There's already Herald of Plague, which kind of does almost this exact same thing, and so you would likely play a different Ascendancy that can get more damage on a single poison in a low tolerance build, in which case you're never taking this node on its own, you are always taking both of these nodes together. Now, I do want to kind of point out, and I want to go against my argument in this video as well, because I think there's actually a lot of nodes in Path of Exile 2 on the Ascendancies that are actually done right. So, for example, let's go through a few of these now. First of all, Warbringer. We already talked about the block branch and how that does feel like an illusion of choice. Well, on the opposite end, you have the Totem branch, which in my opinion is actually done pretty well. So you have Answered Call, which provides this kind of minion system. It's like some ancestral spirits that provide you with some pretty strong buffs, and that is whenever you actually summon a totem. Behind this, you get a very defensive node, which makes your totems take damage before you do. This is still a very powerful option, a very powerful defensive option if you want to go for it. But just because you're taking Answered Call, you're not always going to necessarily be taking Wooden Wall as well. You know, you might find that Answer Call provides you with enough defense. The minions are already tanking for you a little bit. You get some defense from the turtle, for example. There is defensive options there. And you may want to take something else. You may want to take Jade Heritage instead, right? It's not guaranteed that you're always going to take these two nodes together. Another example of this is the Infernalist, right? So the Infernalist has Altered Flesh, which is a very strong defensive notable. I could see builds using this node on its own. You're not necessarily going to be taking one of these reservation nodes here, you know, which provides you with some extra resource based on your life. You may just be taking this node for its pure defensive purposes, and then you may end up going for something else, like, you know, a demon form build that also uses Pyromantic Pact. You could take the Loyal Hellhound. There's a lot of options here, right? There's also the Blood Mage branch here for crit. This one grants you increased critical damage bonus per 40 life, and then the one behind it grants you base critical hit chance for spells is 15%. This makes sense that the order of these nodes is this way round, because base critical hit chance for spells is 15% is extremely powerful, considering there's some spells that they want to make really hard for you to be able to cap the crit chance or get it very high. And they base that around spells having a low base critical hit chance, and so this being a second node makes a lot of sense. But the idea that the increased critical damage bonus per 40 life comes first is a good one, because there's going to be some builds, for example, that want to play a non-spell crit build on Blood Mage, in which case they don't want to interact with Sunder the Flesh in any way, but they do want Gore Spike. And there's going to be other builds that want to play a spell build that already has a high base crit chance, at which point the value of Sunder the Flesh is diminished, and they may not want to take it. There's also the Shock and Chill branches here on the Stormweaver. So the first node on both of these branches kind of allows you to apply a double shock, apply a double chill, and the second node allows all damage to contribute to that shock and, shock chance or chill magnitude. And so, once again, this makes a lot of sense having it this way around. It doesn't feel like you're always going to take both of these nodes together, because there's going to be some builds that want to play a pure lightning setup, in which case this second node is useless to them, but the first node is going to be very powerful, and it's kind of the same there for the chill node. On the Chronomancer, we have another good example of this with Temporal Rift, which is a very powerful spell in its own right. And some builds may want to be playing Temporal Rift, but they may not want to interact in any way with Time Freeze. They might not be interested in playing with Time Freeze. And the idea of Time Freeze being locked in a 2-point node actually makes a lot of sense, because it is extremely powerful, but it doesn't feel like you are always going to take both of these nodes together. Of course, if you want to get to Time Freeze, you have to first go through Temporal Rift, and in some cases you may not want to invest into Temporal Rift, but you are spending 4 points to get to it. But there are the cases there where people may want to play Temporal Rift on its own, and this does feel like a good option for 2 points. So hopefully I was able to properly get across the problem I have there with some of the Ascendancy options in Path of Exile 2. It really does feel like there's an illusion of choice, when in reality, on a Deadeye, if you're going for the Tailwind, you're going to be taking both nodes. It's the same with this Frenzy branch here, by the way. 30% chance that if you would gain Frenzy charges, you instead gain up to your maximum number of Frenzy charges. Okay, that is decent, but it's not that powerful. The reason why this node is there in the first place is to block off Thrilling Chase. Benefits from consuming Frenzy charges for your skills has a 50% chance to be doubled, and so if you're playing a Frenzy charge build that is spending a lot of Frenzy charges to gain their benefits, you are going to be taking both of these notables. You are never only going to be taking Avidity, because it just doesn't make any sense. You want to be able to get to Thrilling Chase, and so once again, this is that illusion of choice. What do you guys think about this kind of Ascendancy issue that I brought up here? Do you think this is a problem? Perhaps you don't think this is an issue at all and you think I'm just complaining for no reason. Let me know in the comment section below. And as always, stay tuned and stay safe.